Welcome. You can look for Matthew chapter 18, where Jesus teaches the parable of the unjust servant, because later on in our study we're going to be talking about that parable. But for now, our study is entitled, But Wait, Just a Moment. And it's the fifth study in our series, Loving God with All of Our Heart, which forms part of our journey of transformation. And we've seen so far that Jesus is inviting us to have an intimate relationship with God as our Father, loving Him heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we'll have much more to say in later studies about how God reveals His love. But for now, wait a moment. There's a question we have to answer first before we commit ourselves to the journey of transformation. Because when you look around at the world, you see a lot of the opposite of love, selfishness, and all the misery and cruelty that selfishness produces. How did it come to be this way? And more importantly, the question is, why does God, who is love, permit such a world to exist in the first place, full of selfishness and the suffering that selfishness causes, especially among people who are innocent? It's a serious question that demands a serious answer before we can have the full confidence in our journey of transformation to love God with all of our hearts. And people react differently to the evil in the world. Some try to isolate themselves from the evil in the world by living in their own bubble and try to avoid touching suffering. Of course, it always comes into their life in some way because selfishness is always there. Others run to God, hoping that God would somehow protect them from the consequences and suffering of selfishness, hoping that they deserve in some way to be protected. Others run from God because they're confused. Confused, of course, by the fact that God allows such suffering to happen because of selfishness. And others, still others, run to God, not to be protected by Him, but to learn from Him how to love as an answer, as a response to the selfishness in the world. People react differently. And this question has been around for a long time. 2,000 years before Jesus lived, the writer of Job addressed the same question about why evil exists and why innocent people suffer in terms of the life of Job. So it's been around for a long time, this question. And even in the New Testament, after the resurrection of Jesus, when people began to preach about the love of Christ, many lost their lives innocently. Stephen was killed at the very beginning. And so was James, the Apostle James, the brother of the Apostle John. James was murdered by Herod, King Herod, because he was preaching the gospel, and Herod wanted to please some religious leaders by killing James. A completely selfish decision on Herod's part to win the affection of certain political leaders by killing James. And John, his brother, must have had to confront the reality of this. Why did God allow this? But John was one of those who ran to God to learn how to love, to be able to respond to the world. And that's why he could write what he wrote in 1 John about the fact that God is love, and those that live in love live in God, and God lives in them. Well, what do we know so far about this? So far we know, of course, that there's enough evidence to confirm the fact that there is a Creator. And in fact, enough evidence to confirm the fact that Jesus expresses to us in a very adequate way who the Creator is and what He is like. He came to express the love of God. But if we were to deny God's existence, the problem of evil would still exist. Because if God does not exist, innocent people still suffer. There is still injustice. In fact, if God does not exist, there's no remedy for injustice. Injustice prevails, and selfish people win. And if that's true, then there is no justice in the universe and no reason for us to claim injustice when it happens to us. We just have to accept the fact that the world is unjust, and we have no reason really to claim justice should prevail. So it is an important question to address, whether we believe or not. But our confidence in the journey of transformation depends on what? In our confidence to love unconditionally. And so we need to think about this question. First of all, unconditional love is a way that we can have communion with the Heavenly Father. It's what makes our relationship possible with God. What could we possibly have in common with a being that's the creator of the universe, whose existence is on an entirely different dimension than our existence is, who is totally and absolutely powerful? What could we possibly have in common with him? The only things we could have in common with him are the qualities of our spirit, because God is spirit and we are spiritual beings. And so when we practice mercy, patience, forgiveness, kindness, goodness, and the Creator shares those qualities himself, then we have the possibility for a relationship with him and fellowship. We participate together with him in his character, which is love. And those qualities, in their unconditional form, represent unconditional love. So the only possibility we have of fellowship with him is based on unconditional love. And unconditional love requires free will. Free will is the ability to make decisions, to choose between alternatives without being obligated or forced to choose a certain alternative. And to be able to love unconditionally, we need to have this ability to make decisions, to decide whether to love or to hate. And in fact, to love unconditionally, or love even when we suffer to love. That requires free will. A determination to make decisions between real alternatives. A robot who is programmed to act in a certain way cannot love, of course, because it's programmed. It doesn't really have any decisions to make, and love is a decision. And the more difficult the circumstances are in which we love, the more free that decision is. So, we want to ask the question, if our fellowship with our Heavenly Father depends on being able to practice unconditional love, and unconditional love requires free will, what kinds of worlds could God create that permit us to love? If we're not satisfied with this world, let's think about some different kinds of worlds that he could have created, and ask whether or not unconditional love is possible in those worlds. For instance, imagine a world in which there is no selfishness. There is no possibility of selfishness or temptation to selfishness. What would it be like? Well, we would be created without the ability to be selfish or to think selfishly. There would be no evil, no selfishness, no envy, no contrary desire, and of course no suffering, no cruelty that comes from selfishness, no disagreeable consequences. But at the same time, there would be no real choice between alternatives, because there would not be any alternatives. There's only one thing to do, and that would be love, and love because we were created to love and love only, just like a robot. We wouldn't have choices. And love without a decision to love is not an act of our will, but the result of obligation. Love in this case is not moved by compassion or humility or mercy. It's not moved by anything. It's part of our nature. And so the emotion of love could not exist. And how would we show love in such a world where there is no suffering, no one to care for because no one has any needs? no challenges to love people. So in such a world where there is no selfishness, the reality is there's no decisions either, and no possibility of really, genuinely loving. Well, let's think about a different world, a slightly different world. A world in which there is, in reality, selfishness, but no consequences, no suffering. No suffering from being selfish, for instance. It would certainly be an agreeable and a pleasant place to live because we would never suffer anything. We would have the ability to make decisions, at least on the surface, deciding between whether to be selfish or loving. But in reality, in such a world where there are no bad consequences, selfishness and love would result in the same thing. If we deceived somebody or cheated someone or were greedy, our relationships would remain the same as if we loved. Selfishness would lose its bad reputation. And God would have to constantly intervene because if somebody selfishly wanted to kill somebody and shoot them, the bullets would have to turn to feathers, or the knife would have to turn to butter. So in such a world, where on the surface we have decisions, those decisions are really meaningless because the alternatives result in the same thing. And so love is meaningless. In such a world, what would love look like? Love would look the same as hatred. Lying would be the same as telling the truth, and greed would be the same as generosity. And so in such a world, love becomes meaningless. Decisions on the surface, but meaningless love. Well, let's think about another possible alternative world that God could have created. He could have created a world in which there is selfishness, and selfishness or selfish people receive consequences for selfishness, but immediate consequences. And those who are innocent don't suffer. What would the world look like? It would mean a violent person who acts violently would be treated violently immediately afterwards as payment for his violence. A person who steals would lose something very valuable to them in the very moment that they stole. A liar's nose would grow long in the moment they started lying. Would you smoke if you knew, if we smoke cigarettes, if you knew that in the moment that you smoked, you would immediately have cancer in your lungs, your throat, or your mouth? Of course not. You would understand there's immediate danger, and you would want to avoid that immediate danger. But in such a world, people would do what's right only to avoid the bad consequences, the immediate bad consequences of doing wrong. There might be good people, but they would be good to avoid those bad consequences. And what would love be like? Well, we would love to protect ourselves from the bad consequences, the immediately bad consequences of hating somebody. This is just really the same as loving to gain something or to receive payment in return for love. We would love to avoid suffering, but not love when we have to suffer. Because actually, some forms of unconditional love almost require suffering, or suffering is part of them. Because, for instance, if you forgive somebody who offends you, and they offend you again, and you forgive them again, and they offend you again, and you still continue to forgive them because you want to be a forgiving person, you suffer. You suffer innocently because you have to keep absorbing the cost of their offenses. Mercy would not be possible in such a world either, because you would not relieve the suffering of an evil person. They're receiving evil consequences for their evil conduct immediately. So, in such a world, people would love to avoid the consequences of not loving. And we're not interested in loving for that reason. What we're interested in is learning how to love unconditionally, as an act of free will, without obligation, where the alternatives are real. Okay, so let's imagine a different kind of world. A world in which there is evil, selfishness caused by evil caused by selfishness, where selfishness doesn't receive immediate consequences, but in fact temporarily can win and seem attractive. And if selfishness benefits, at least for a time, then innocence will suffer, because selfishness will take advantage of those who are innocent. But let's see what this world would look like. What would it look like? It would mean, of course, that lying or cheating would gain people something, at least temporarily. Violence would lead to power over people who are weaker. And people who are seeking peace and being patient would be taken advantage of sometimes. There would be extreme cases of cruelty and people suffering, innocent people suffering, because for a while, selfishness seems at least attractive. But in this way, selfishness and love are real alternatives, and decisions really can be made in such a situation, where there are real alternatives, real options. And in fact, when the options both can be attractive for their own reasons. So what would love look like in such a world? Forgiveness would be possible then, because forgiveness sometimes suffers to forgive, like we said. And good, loving, would not immediately result in receiving love in return. And, in fact, unconditional love would be possible in such a world then, because there are real alternatives, authentic options, and the possibility to decide whether to love or to hate, and being able to love unconditionally, and even suffer when you're loving unconditionally, in order to be love, in order to become a loving person. So in this world, in contrast to all the other worlds we've thought about, in this world, in such a world, unconditional love is possible, where free will is possible and real alternative choices are possible. But that's the world we live in. This world is the world God created for us. It's the world in which we can have fellowship and communion with Him. And all of this is necessary in order for us to learn to love as He is love. But the fact is, those who are selfish might gain, but gain for a while. When Jesus came, He revealed not only God's love, but also His justice. And justice means to do what is right, to do what corresponds. It includes the fact that those who are selfish will receive corresponding consequences for selfishness. This is what Jesus taught in the parable of the unjust servant. I want you to read with me in Matthew chapter 18, beginning with verse 23. He says, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay me back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, Be patient with me, and I will pay it back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. Let's stop right there for a moment. So what happens here? The king, the master of this servant, forgave him of a huge, enormous debt that he could never repay himself. This is unconditional love. It's an act of grace in forgiving this man of this debt. And the king himself, being innocent, suffered for that because he's the one who had to absorb this great debt, since the servant would not pay it and would not be able to pay it. He freely forgave him, motivated by compassion for the man. But the man goes out then and finds a fellow servant who owes him very little money in comparison to what he had owed the king. And he starts to choke him and demands that he pay him this small amount, or else he would put him into prison. And he does put him into prison. Lacks any compassion whatsoever. What happens is people hear about this. And it says in verse 31, "When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened." Why were they outraged? Because it was unjust what the servant did. Because it would have been right for him to treat his servant, his fellow servant rather, and in the same way that he had been treated by the king. He ought to forgive his fellow servant as he was forgiven by the king. That would be the just thing to do. And when other people heard about what he had done, they were outraged because it was unjust. And of course it was. So what happens? It says, "Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." So maybe for a moment, a little while, this servant who had been forgiven gained by sending his fellow servant to prison what he gained in power over his fellow servant by treating him so violently. But finally he received justice. So here you see in this king love, unconditional love, that's his first and foremost motivation for acting towards his servant. Unconditional love. He's moved by compassion. But finally he must also be just. And that's what Jesus was revealing about the Father. He is love, but he's also just. And while we wait for the justice of the Father, and innocent people suffer, we suffer sometimes innocently. We hurt. We hurt when we see other people suffer. But Jesus came to teach us too that the Father hurts too while we're waiting for justice. But in the meantime, the selfishness in the world ought to make us run to God, run to the loving Father, to let him teach us how to love in response to this world of selfishness. So we run to the Father. Let him teach us how to love. And let us respond with unconditional love, because this is the point of contact between us and the Heavenly Father. May God bless you.